Hello everyone, welcome back to another video on the CG Lounge YouTube channel. In this video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to make your Arch-Viz scenes in Unreal Engine interactive. So I got this scene for free on the Epic Games Store. You can also download it from the Epic Games Store for free if you want to follow along. Or you can just apply whatever I'm about to show you now on your personal projects. So the project I'm using is real-time Arch-Viz. Here it is, as you can see on the screen. It says it only supports up to Unreal Engine 5.0, but all you have to do is create a project, and then once you create it, just go over to where you made it and then right click on this file, switch Unreal Engine version, and change it to whatever you have. So I'm using 5.1. Then after that, you just have to launch it. Okay, so I'm not going to explain everything you need to know when using Unreal Engine because that's going to make this video take way too long. So I'm simply just going to explain what I'm doing, and hopefully that'll be enough. So first thing is once we press play, what you'll notice is we don't have like an actual character. What we have instead is some like floating camera. So depending on your project, you may want this, but for this example, I'm going to actually have it be a character that walks around. So in the content folder, I'm going to right click, blueprint class, and then I'm going to create a character blueprint. Now you can create a pawn blueprint, but the reason why I'm making a character blueprint is because it's going to give us like a capsule, and it'll just have everything set up already. Also for the pawn, you might get that floaty camera thing, and you're going to have to do a lot more tweaking to get it to be like a person walking. So I'm just going to call this character, or BP underscore character, and BP just simply stands for blueprint. Okay, so now I'm going to open up the blueprint class. Okay, so as you can see, we have this capsule here. This is what I was talking about when it'll give us like a character rather than like a floaty camera. Okay, so now that we have this character, what you'll notice is if you try to drag this in here and then you press play, you're not actually going to play as that character. So what we need to do instead is we're going to have to create a game mode blueprint. So again, right click, blueprint class, game mode base, and we'll just call this BP underscore game mode. Or we'll call this Arch-Viz game mode. Now when you open it up, there will be nothing in it, which is completely fine. What we want to do here is go to the default pawn class and change it to our BP underscore character. And then as for a player controller, the default should be fine. So just click compile, file, then save all. Okay, so now that we have set our pawn to be our BP underscore character, what you want to do now is click this drop down over here, go to world override, hover over this and go to select game mode class and choose the BP underscore Arch-Viz game mode, and save all just to be safe. So now when we press play, we're not going to notice how our camera is a lot higher and we can't move now. That's because now we're actually selected as this character. Okay, so to add input and allow for movement, we're going to need to do a couple of things. Now this is a bit more complicated than the older ways, but it is much more advanced, and the older way is likely going to get removed. So I'm going to show you how to do it with the new way. I'm going to make a new folder, call it input, and in here I'm going to right click input and create an input action. Call this IA for input action underscore move, and then create one more IA underscore look for our mouse movement to look around. And then now we need one more thing called input mapping context, IMC underscore, and we'll just call this controls. And I'm going to save all. Now in the move input action, change value type to a axis 2D because we're trying to get values for going forward and to the side. And then for look, you also want to do the same thing. So after you've done that for both of them, just save all. And then in the input mapping controls, this is where we'll actually map certain keys to these events. So we're going to press plus over here twice, or actually we have to select one first. So IA underscore look, now add the other one for IA underscore move. Now for move, the first map key we want to map to this event is W for walk forward. So just click on this keyboard icon and then you can just press your keyboard and you'll get it right away. And then now you want to press plus over here so we can get more to map to. So we got W, A, S, and D. And then for look, type in X, Y, So that'll be for mouse movement on the X and Y axis. So now we got WASD, which will fire off this IA move event. And the reason why I say event is because every time you click these, wherever you implement these input actions, they're going to fire off an event which you can connect functionality onto. You'll see that later when we start working inside of the character blueprint. And then for the look, we have our XY because, we want to move our mouse on the XY axis. Okay, so now we want to do a couple more things. You want to click this drop down here for W, and on modifiers, click the plus, and you want to look for swizzle input axis values. And then you want to click this drop down one more time, make sure it's Y, X, Z. So by doing this, we allow this input key for W to be registered as like a Y axis for like forward and backward rather than an X axis, which is going to be sideways. And sideways is the default. So because of that, okay, so we're done here. When you click the drop down for A, all we need for modifiers is negate. And the reason why we negate is because we're moving left. That's for A, so it's going to be a negative value. Oh, and I should mention, just like how in this swizzle thing you need Y, X, Z, you want to go over to A, make sure negate has all X, Y, Z checked. Okay, so now for S, because S is the opposite of W, and W we wanted to register on the Y axis. Now we want to do the same thing. Modifiers, swizzle, and make sure it's Y, X, Z. So now it's being registered on the Y axis just like the W mapping, but now because S is going backwards, we want to reverse that. So you want to add another modifier, and this one is going to be negate. And click the drop down, make sure all boxes are checked. And now D, we can just leave it. Okay, so now that we have that all done, you just want to press save, or file, save all, and then now move on to the blueprint character. Now here, first thing you want to do is add a camera. And this camera will be a child of the capsule component. Press enter and then move it to like eye level, compile, save all. And what this camera is going to be is our, viewpoint. So now that the camera is done, let's move over to the event graph. So the first thing you want to do is right click and get controller. This is going to get the controller that is going to be controlling this character blueprint, which is which inherits from the pawn class, which is why it says target is pawn. But if you hover over it, it says returns controller for this actor. So from here, you want to cast to player controller, and this will essentially allow us to get like a direct reference to the player controller class. Now, the reason why I know this is called player controller is because if you go over to our game mode, double click on it, what you'll notice is for the player controller class, it creates one called player controller. So have it cast to player controller. And from here, what you want to do is you want to get enhanced input local player subsystem, and you want to, off of this thing, check if it is valid. So this thing is essentially just how you set up the new input method in Unreal Engine. And the reason why we're checking if it's valid is because if it is not, and we have it do some functionality, then your game will likely crash because it's trying to refer to something that doesn't actually exist in memory. So dragging off of this, you want to type in add mapping context, drag it into there, and the mapping context is imc_controls, which we made. So now press compile and save all. So now we want to call our input action. Let's start off with input action look. So on triggered, what we want to do is we want to drag off and do controller yaw input. So for the yaw input, which is left and right, we want to use the X value. So from here, remember we chose vector 2D. If we go over into look, we chose vector 2D. So this thing contains two values in here. So if you just right click and split struct pin, you'll get those two out. So you want to use X for the yaw input, and then now you want to do one more, add controller pitch input, and pitch is going to be Y, and this one's going to be up and down. And that is it for look. So something I noticed is that our vertical input for looking around is actually reversed. So what we're going to have to do here is in the input mapping controls, type in mouse, and we're actually going to split this up. So we have mouse X, and then we'll have mouse Y. Now for mouse Y, go to modifiers, just change it to negate. We also need the swizzle. Alright, there we go. So that fixes everything. Now we want one more for move, so I_move. So to add movement input, just type in add movement input, and then drag when it's triggered off into here. And you want to do the same thing, split struct pin. You want to have two, one for forward, one for the sideways. So for sideways, it'll be X, forward will be Y. So what you'll notice is that this is a scale value. It's like a multiplier. So the way to actually assign a direction would be to pass in values into this world direction. So to start off, we want to get rotation. So get control rotation. It'll get the rotation like of our controller. So like it says over here, and this returns a rotator. And what you want to do here, split struct pin, because we don't actually want to use all of these. We actually just want to be using X and Z. For right, you actually want to get right vector, or let me just type in get right vector, and right click, split struct pin, use the X and Z, drag that into here. And then for forward, you want to get forward vector. Again, split struct pin, this time we're only going to be using Z. Plug that in. Okay, so after you've done this setup, there's one more thing to do. What you want to do is click on the self component, type in pawn, and this should be checked, this use controller rotation yaw. You want to uncheck that. And what you want to do instead is click camera, type in pawn, and use pawn control rotation. And then now you should have movement working perfectly fine. And earlier I said that I wanted to use the character blueprint class because it has something set up for us. An example of that is right here, this character movement component. So what you'll notice is that our character was moving really fast. So all I have to do is check under the max walk speed and then drop it to like 300. And if I walk around now, it's much slower. And because this whole area is actually really small, I'm just going to drop it down a little bit more. Okay, so now we have the movement for our character done. Now we actually want to add functionality to interact with our scene. First thing you want to do is you want to create a UI element that you can interact with. So for that, I'm going to right click, make a new folder. We'll call this UI. And in here, right click user interface and click widget blueprint. Now I'm going to call widget underscore, and we'll call this modify, and double click on it. Now this designer tab over here is where you design how your widget will look like. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to have values to modify the RGB color. First thing you want to do is type in canvas in the search palette and drag that in, drop it over here to make it a child of this whole thing. And this canvas panel essentially is your workspace. I'm going to have one button. I'm going to drag that down here. I'm going to name it back button. And then I'm going to grab this text component, drag it to be a child of the back button. And we'll call this back text. And I'll name it over here, just back. And then I'm also going to make the button quite a bit bigger. And I'm going to change the font size. So now that we have this, for my RGB values, I'm just going to drag in 3 sliders. Now what you'll notice is that each of these things have this like anchor. This is so then if your screen changes resolution or size, you can check by dragging down here. You can ensure that these will be positioned properly. So as you can see, if the aspect ratio goes off, certain elements go off screen. So you can find an anchor point. So that way they always stay on screen no matter the resolution. But for this tutorial, I'm just going to be showing you guys how to get the functionality down. So I'm not going to focus on optimizing the UI. Okay, so for each of these, I want to specify what is what. So I'm going to drop a text block right here. We'll call this one the R value. Okay, so as we know, RGB goes up from 0 to 255. So for each slider, max value set to 255. And then after that, for each step size, put it as 1 or anything you like. And I'm also going to name this to r_slider and then b_slider. So in the graph, click on one slider, and what you'll notice is down here in the details panel, you have all these events that get fired off. So on value changed is when we're going to want to fire some functionality off. So in the widget, go to variables, add, click this drop down. It is static mesh actor, object reference, pile, save all, and then name this room. So now that you've created that, click this eye icon to make it public and then press compile. So first thing I want to do is I want to drag off this and press get room. So now we should have a reference to the room, and from here we want to set material vector parameter, and then you'll have 3, but what you notice is each of these refer to a different thing. This one is for materials, this one's for default custom primitive data, and this one's for custom primitive data. What we want to set is vector parameter values on the materials, so we're going to click on that. Now what you'll notice is that this mesh has a bunch of material elements or material IDs, and we could make a setup to modify each one individually, but typically that's not recommended. It's better off if you actually split this room off into individual parts, like individual walls. That way one wall has one material only. Now for this tutorial, I'm just going to be showing you guys an example on just one material. So for that one, I'm going to just choose the tiled wall material because I actually want to modify the way that one looks. So to do that, I'm just going to select the room, open the level blueprint, right click, create a reference to it. And what you want to do is you want to create dynamic material instance, and it automatically gets this static mesh component for us because that's like the only thing that can get a material. And now you want to drag this into here, so then it's the execution pin, so that runs. And then the element index for the patterns is element 4. And then you want to do m_tiles m_patterned, or what's the material called? m_wall tiles. m_wall tiles pattern, compile, file, save all. So now this mesh has a dynamic material on element index 4. Okay, so now that we have this node down, when I opened up our material, we have one called albedo color. That is the parameter name. So albedo color. Make sure it's capitalized the same way as well. And then you just want to press compile, save all. And now you can just drag this into here. And now that that is done, what you want to do is you want to split struct pin, and you'll get our RGB values. So XYZ RGB. So this B value is going to go straight into Z RGB. Now another thing you want to do is, if you do it this way, every time you modify one slider, the other slider values are going to get set to 0. So to counter this, we're going to actually create variables for each 3 input. So let's right click, promote to variable. So now you can rename these to be RGB if you want to, but I'm going to keep it as XYZ. So now we have each of these parameters. So once we change the B, we want to, so get here parameter Z RGB, so that's B. Drag here set. We want to set this variable to be equal to whatever value it is. And now you just want to drag it into here. So now whatever B is will be set here, but this won't always be set to 0 anymore. This will be set to whatever X and Y value or RG value we set. Now if we do the same here, so we get the G slider and on value changed, and we just set RG, so Y, if we set this value. So let's say we change the G value, we set it at 50, it saves 50 in this variable. So next time if we change the B slider only, we still have 50 saved in this variable called parameter value Y. So the G value will be set to 50. it won't be set to 0 anymore. So that's essentially how this whole setup works. So now we can just copy these things. And now when we press the back button, we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to get unclicked, remove all widgets. Now we're going to be doing a couple of things before we actually create this widget, which we will get to. But basically what's going to happen is we're going to set it where we get input on widgets only, and then it's going to show our mouse cursor. So when we go back, we want to undo that. So the way we do that is we right click, get controller, and get the player controller. And because we're the only one in the game, there's only one player controller, so that's just going to be this one. And then we want to drag off of this and type in show, set show mouse cursor to be false, and then we want to set input to be game only. Compile, file, save all. So I'm gonna just do this in front of each wall. So I'm gonna click on the plus, click on volumes, then there should be a trigger volume. I'm gonna drag this in here. Okay, there we go. I'm going to save all. And now what we want to do is go into our level blueprint. So with that one trigger volume selected, just right click and click this drop down, add event. So collision. So on actor, begin overlap. So when the player overlaps this, so get overlapped actor, we want to cast to BP underscore character. So if the character overlapped, and this means true, so if it's true that the character overlapped, we don't want to actually show up. We don't want this thing to show up right away, because that'll get annoying, right? Every time you overlap the box, that pops up, even if you don't want to modify it. So what I'm going to do here in the UI, I'm going to create another widget. And this one's just going to be called interact, or w underscore interact prompt. Open this up, and I'm just going to quickly do this, because this tutorial is already taking a long time. So canvas panel, text, I'm going to make the font size massive, and we'll just call this press E to change, to modify the material. And then it's too big, so I'm just going to bring this down here, compile, file, save all. And now what we want is, once you overlap, what we want to do is create a widget. It is going to be called, or it is called w underscore interact prompt. And then for the owning player, that is going to be the player controller. So get player controller. And like I said, there's only one player in the game, so index is going to be 0. Get the owning player, and then from the reference, we want to add to viewport. Oops. You want to use the other actor. That is the one that has to be overlapped. So now we go over here, we get that prompt. So yeah, overlapped actor, it's referring to itself. So this is actually always going to cast to be false. Yeah, I hate the naming scheme of these overlap events. They're a bit confusing. But other actor is the other actor that overlapped this volume, and overlapped actor is referring to itself. Now at the moment we press E, absolutely nothing happens. So what we want to do now is we want to essentially get if the player presses E. So let's create a variable in here. We'll call this E pressed, and compile. By default, keep as false, and it's a boolean because we want to see if it's true or false. So right click, press E, and we'll get a bunch of results, but you want to look for the input. Okay, so E, here we go. So when you press E, we want to set press to be true. And once you release E, you want to set press to be false. Okay, so simple enough. Now we want to go over here and we want a branch. A branch is like an if statement. So put that, drag in E pressed into the condition. So if E pressed is true, what we want to do is remove all widgets. So we're going to remove this prompt, and then instead we want to create a new widget. And this widget is going to be our modify widget. So w underscore modify, and we want the same thing, the player controller. And then we want to add to viewport. And because we want to interact with the widget now, not the game, off of this we want to set input mode to be game, or to be UI only. And then the widget to focus is this one we just created, so grab the reference to this. And then now we also want to show mouse cursor. And all of this code right here, this section over here, is the reason why inside of the modify thing, I had once you press back, we don't show the mouse cursor anymore and we set input to game only. We're essentially undoing the work we just did over here. Now I just realized a problem. This fire once you overlap. So it's only once you overlap this that it'll fire. So if you're not already pressing E the moment you walk in, then it's not going to do anything. So we're going to have this thing loop. So we're going to drag off this, set a delay, and then just bring it back into the branch. And then press true or press play after you compile and save. So now it's constantly looping. You press E one time. Now we get the option. And then now if you press back, you can move again, just like that. And now we want another thing. We'll address those errors later. We want, once you stop overlapping, so have the trigger volume selected still, right click, add event, collision, we want on end overlap. And we're gonna do the same thing, cast to see if this is the player that ended the overlap. We want to remove all widgets. Now that we've done that, we can now actually pass in the reference. That's why we were getting a bunch of errors. Well, in this modify thing, it was trying to modify this room variable, but it was empty. So to make sure it's not empty, what we want to do is select the room and in the level blueprint, get a reference to it. So now when you create the modify widget, we want to set room, that room variable, set it to be this thing. As you can see, we're now changing the colors. And what you notice is I can't move in the game because input mode has been set to UI only. Now the moment you press back, we can move again. Now something you will have noticed is that everything has been set to whatever we modified it to. This is why I mentioned that typically you don't want to combine multiple elements into one mesh like they have here, because then you'll encounter this problem. And that's a problem because you can only set a vector parameter on the material. You can't actually specify. So like if we type in set vector parameter, as you can see, it's only on materials. We can't actually modify it to be like for a specific material. So yeah, that's like one of the biggest problems. So instead, just for a better example, I am going to select this chair, and then I will get a reference to that instead. So right click, create reference, and then drag this into here, and it should work the same as long as the material name for the chair is also albedo color. So go over here, press E, and yep, as you can see, we can modify the color of the chair. And then press back. Now we have a white chair. Now you can also do the same thing if we open up this material. As you can see, we have ambient occlusion, metalness, normal, roughness. And because these aren't vectors, these are just scalar parameters. The only difference you'd have to do here is instead of set vector parameter, you'd have to do set scalar parameter value. And then just type in the name. So that's the only difference if you want to modify things that aren't just colors, like you want to modify metalness values as well. I'm just gonna do the rest of these volumes, copy and paste all of this here because they're essentially the same thing, right? We're doing the same thing. We're getting the overlap. We're seeing if E is pressed, and then we're just bringing up like the same widgets. So the only difference is I'm not going to be doing it for the room anymore. Okay, so what I'm going to do for this one is actually just the table for this volume. So I'm going to right click, create a reference to it. And we'll drag this one into here. And then just to remove some confusion, I'm going to rename this variable from room to mesh. Now we just need to select this volume, right click, add event, begin overlap, and then we want to add another event, end overlap. Now we come over here, press E, we can modify the table's colors. Now what you'll notice as well is that this is actually clipping. The values are going way past 1 and you're getting like this bright glow. To fix that, all we have to do is just simply change the max value down back to 1, And because it's now 1, I'm going to change the step size to be back to the default 0.01. So we just press E to modify the material. The values aren't really clipping anymore. That's pretty much it. Now before I go for this last example, I want to show how you do it for multiple objects. First, creating a variable. And let's get these are static mesh actors. So static mesh actor. And we want to get an object reference to it. And we'll just call this one meshes. And because we're getting multiple, we want to make the type to be an array. So this is like a collection of these objects. So now what we can do is type in get meshes and then go to add. And then on begin play, we want to add all those 4 chairs. So let's start with 1 chair. Right click, create a reference. We want to add you. Now we want to do just the same thing. Okay, so now we have all 4 chairs into this array and we want them to be added on begin play. And now this is where the difference comes. I'm going to create a duplicate of this UI element. And the reason why I'm doing that is because we changed the variable type. As you recall in here, the mesh, it's just 1. But now we need to change this to be an array type. And then we want to click on change variable type. And so yeah, that's why we want to make a duplicate. And now what you notice is that this is also invalid. And that's because, like I said, now it's multiple meshes. So to deal with this, now what you want is a for each loop. So now for each actor inside of this array, drag this out, it'll do all of this. And then loop body, so then each time it encounters a new mesh within this array, it fires off. Okay, so now go over into here, begin overlap, end overlap. We're gonna copy and paste. So same thing really. The only difference now is we're creating w underscore modify multiple, and then we are setting set mesh. Notice it's an array type, and we have this array right here. Drag that into there. So now if we come over to this volume and we press E, we can modify the value for all the chairs that we selected. Alright, so that is pretty much it for the tutorial. I'm just going to give a quick little recap because this was a lot to do. The beginning, we literally just set the functionality to move around as a character, so I'm going to skip out on that part. And then we added these trigger boxes once we got close to certain objects, so that way we could prompt the user to press E to modify material. And the way we did that was we created a UI called interact prompt, which literally says press E to modify the material. And then in the level blueprint, we had it where once you overlapped, we cast it to make sure it's the player that overlapped it. We got our controller, and since there's only 1 player in the game, index is going to be 0. We created the widget that gave up the interact prompt, and then we checked to see if E is pressed, which is just a variable, which is a Boolean variable, so it's true or false. If it's pressed, it becomes true for E is pressed. Once you released it, E is no longer pressed, so it gets set to false. And then it goes to this branch, which constantly checks every 0.2 seconds to see if it is pressed, because without this, the moment you overlap, it checks it 1 time. So if you're not pressing E immediately, it won't work, because it's not checking to see if you pressed E again while you're within that collision box. So that's why we had this thing loop. So if it's true, we're going to remove all widgets, which will just remove this interact prompt. And we're going to create a new one, which is the modify widget. And for this case, we're doing the original modify widget, which is this one. So that it creates that on screen. And then after it creates it onto the screen, we pass in the variable of the mesh we want to modify. So we pass that into the widget, and then we added the widget to a viewport. And then we set the input mode to be UI only, so that way you can't move in the game, and so that you can interact with the widget. And then we set show mouse cursor to be true, so that you can see where you're about to click. And then we made another version of this, which modifies multiple. And the only difference with that is that we made a duplicate of the modify widget, and in this one, we changed the mesh variable type to be an array type, which is a collection of variables. So now we have a collection of mesh actors. So everything is the same as the previous one. The only difference now is that we're passing in a meshes array, so a collection of meshes, and we're setting that variable inside of the modify multiple widget. And we got this array to modify multiple by using this event begin play, and by creating a new variable called meshes of a static mesh actor array type. And then from the event begin play, we added chairs. So all these chairs, remember we selected 4 chairs, we added all of these chairs to this meshes variable, this array variable on begin play. Now once you overlap the trigger volume 2, rather than it passing in 1 like the previous one, it is now passing in this array, and everything else is it does the same. Now the difference between this widget to modify multiple and single is that in the array to modify multiple, we can no longer just pass in the variable of the mesh reference directly to set the parameter value. Now we had to use a for each loop so that we can loop through each and every single reference of that chair we had inside of this array. So then it's essentially saying for each chair inside of this array, we want to modify the material on them. And we use loop body because we want to have it modify for every single mesh, for every single chair mesh it encounters. And then this array element essentially just returns that chair on the iteration it's on. So if it's on the first iteration, it returns the first chair it finds in the array. Second iteration, it returns the second chair it finds, and so on. That's the difference between the multiple widget. We're just using a different variable type, with this one being an array type. And we are using a for each loop to loop through it. And inside of these widgets, they're just basic sliders that get the value from them and set it. And then in the game mode, we set our default stuff so then we spawn properly. If you want to go ahead and modify like the normal strength, boom, right there, normal strength is the parameter name. So then you'd have to use set scalar parameter, type in normal strength as the parameter. All right, so yeah, that is pretty much it for the recap. So yeah, now you have an Arch-Viz project where you can go through, modify the colors. And if you want to, you can even go over and modify the metallic strength, roughness strength, and so on. But yeah, that is pretty much it for this tutorial. If you have any questions, leave a comment in the comment section down below, or just join the Discord. And that is it.